early in the new year, it's always state of the collection video time. A lot of them come out. I watched a lot of them. I looked at a lot of the comments. A lot of those comments said things along the line of nice collection, good collection, well done, which got me thinking, if there's such a thing as a good collection that inspires a comment, is there such a thing as a bad collection? And what might that be? I wasn't sure where my thinking was going. I did a video asking you guys for some input. I've had a bit more of a think about that question, and I'm ready to sort of take it to the next step and have another discussion about it. So here we go. Okay, so first things first, a lot of you responded by saying that you don't care about other people's collections. That's fine. I'm not sure why you had to tell me that you don't care about something, but that always happens. So yeah, there was a bunch of people who said they don't care about other collections. Just I'll record that and move on. Next, there was a group of people saying that it's all subjective, as though that somehow shuts the conversation down. You can't make a judgment if it's subjective, seems to be the theme. I suppose I disagree. I say that the only judgments worth making are subjective. The only discussions worth having are around the areas that are subjective, and that if we were to shrink everything down to the purely objective facts, the things that are written on a spec sheet, then we can probably wind up YouTube and move on to something else in our lives tomorrow. Next, I would say that there was a real reticence to call any collection bad, that there was a general sense that there are noteworthy collections that are worthy of some kind of thumbs up, and then there are other collections. But I think the general sense of those people who commented was, and certainly sort of where I've landed, is that there are great collections, there are good collections, and then there are just collections. So then it comes down to, if there are just still good collections and very good collections, how do we grade them? And then more importantly, how do we even look at the collection to form that opinion? I basically thought you could divide those lenses through which we would look at a collection into three. The first is what I'm going to call the inner life sort of idea, and that is our sort of assessment of how well that collection is making its collector happy. The next one is more of a sort of a viewer thought process about how the collection presented would make them happy. So it was more like I was looking at the collection you presented and then making an assessment sort of on my behalf. Would that way of collecting make me happy? The third lens that I saw a few people use, and which I kind of have fallen into using myself, is rather than look at the collection as a collection of watches that I may want or may not want, but rather looking at the state of the collection video as the culmination of collecting as a kind of performance art. And did the collection and the process leading to it simply make good content? So they were really, as I say, kind of the three ways that people looked at this. Okay, so they're the sort of big picture, narrowing down a little bit. Let's talk about some of the specifics that you guys mentioned. Now, I'm not going to drag out specific comments. Most of these I've train smashed into each other into, general ideas, although there are one or two that really stood out to me. The first is from, and I apologize if I get this name wrong, Hervé, I think it is, who had a fairly poetic approach. And I'm going to paraphrase it and I think make it even more poetic. He probably summarized that inner life, that inward looking view best of anyone, where he said a good collection is full of watches that make you smile. A bad collection is a watch box full of regrets, which I think is a lovely way of kind of thinking about what would be a good or a bad collection for the person who'd collected it. Whilst I do love that definition of I think it's very difficult for us to apply to someone else unless they actually do a state of the collection video where they come out and say, I hate half my watches and I wish I hadn't bought them. Kez took a slightly different view, but I think a similarly poetic, similarly kind of esoteric view of what made a good collection. And this was one that really stuck with me because he looked at collections as an entity of themselves, not simply an accumulation of individual watches, and which is very much how I like to look at it. What Kez said was a good collection was one where the collection was greater than the sum of its parts, where the value of the collection as a whole transcended the value of any particular watch within it. Unfortunately, as much as I like the idea that Kez had, I just don't think it's going to come up very often. I think that the vast majority, according to the polls I've done, the vast majority of collectors don't really think of themselves as curating a thematic collection that is more than the sum of its parts. Most people seem to think of their collection more as just an assortment of individual watches, which is unfortunate because I think that, the idea that Kez has could be really interesting and fun. Now, this wasn't super common, but there was the occasional person who just came flat out and said, a good collection is a collection with the watches that I personally want to buy. In other words, I'll give someone a thumbs up if their collection is essentially the collection that I wish I could have. I must admit, I was a little surprised that that was so uncommon. I thought that there would have been more of those, but there was, all of the comments I got, there was only 2 or 3 people that really said that. By far the most common consensus view seemed to be less about the collection of watches, but more about the process of collecting that led to those watches. Most people seem to think that a good collection was whatever you got to in the end that followed the kind of collecting progress that you could get behind. So that generally meant, for example, most people, again, according to my polls, think that you should try and wear, or you should wear, most of your watches. Therefore, there was a heavy emphasis on good collections are ones where all the watches get worn. On top of that, there was a lot of discussion around a good collection is one which represents the collector, that you can see the collector in the collection. One where there's a story behind the watches and you can see how the watches, sort of what the watches meant to the collector and how they ended up in the collection. Ultimately, it came down to that there was a kind of thoughtfulness that led to the collection, that there was something more than just a random, I bought whatever was available at the time around the collecting. Okay, so what are my thoughts? What do I assess as a good collection? What is it that inspires me to leave a thumbs up on someone's State of the Collection video? I really loved Hervé's poetic view of, a good collection is full of smiles and a bad collection is full of regrets. I really liked Kez's idea that a good collection is greater than the sum of its parts. But my problem with Hervé's is that's very difficult for us as an outsider to assess. And my problem with Kez's is so few people collect that way that it's not something that's going to come up very often. Ultimately, though, I went back and thought about how is it that I view a collection? When I'm watching a collection and I'm making that very fast mental assessment, what is leading me to make a thumbs up or a move on? And really, the first thing is, how am I looking at these collections? I've discovered I'm very much in category 3 that I spoke about earlier. I view State of the Collection videos as kind of the final act of a piece of performance art that is watch collecting. I very much look at the whole thing as a kind of content that me as a watch enthusiast will just absorb and enjoy. And 2 things are going on at the moment. So while I'm thinking about this and, what's a good collection and why would I enjoy a piece of, a State of the Collection video, I've actually been rereading some old Hemingway and been reading For Who the Bell Tolls. And that got me, so as all the time I'm thinking about this, I've had Hemingway and in particular, one of the things that Hemingway really loved just kept intruding on my mind. And that is the idea of bullfighting. And I began to think of watch collecting as a kind of bullfight. Because one of the things about bullfighting is it's not really a sport. It's more of an art form. After all, the outcome is rarely in doubt. The contest in a bullfight isn't really between the bullfighter and the bull. As I said, that the final outcome of that contest is largely decided already. It's really a fight between the bullfighter, or a contest between the bullfighter and themselves to see how great a performance can they make. Okay, so the first thing is I won't pretend I did this from memory. What happened was, as I'm having these thoughts, I started looking more and doing some more research on the net into sort of bullfighting and how that works and how they talk about matadors, and then thinking hard about what does that mean in terms of if I was a watch collector. And the first thing that struck me was how when great matadors are being sort of profiled, they're almost never compared to sportsmen. They were generally compared to artists. They were compared to Goya and Velázquez and Picasso, not, footballers, for example. And secondly, the kinds of words to use to discuss them would be things like classical or graceful, elegant, courageous, daring. And one of the key attributes that kept coming up was how close were they willing to get to the horns, and how long were they prepared to stay there? How much could they rely upon that graceful swivel just to avoid the fatal collision rather than a cowardly step out of the way? So a great matador shows skill, grace, daring, and themselves in the face of real stakes. Now for them, that's injury, perhaps even death. I see a parallel with that in how I look at other people's collecting and ultimately how I look at their state of the collection videos. Do I see skill? Do I see daring? Do I see people taking real risks? Now, for us, no one's going to get injured. Certainly no one's going to get killed. But there's still risk in what we do, in where we choose to get a watch, the watches we choose to buy, how we choose to treat those watches. For me, if I see a collection where there is this real skill, people have seen things normal people can't. People have shown real grace in how the choices that they've made and how these watches fit together. They've shown real daring in the watches that they've chosen to buy and how they chose to buy them. For me, that's a great watch collection. That's a video that gets a thumbs up and a little comment. Good collection there, mate. One of the problems with doing any research on the internet is, of course, you end up going down rabbit holes. As soon as you start opening up the question of Hemingway and bullfighting, then you end up with other sort of literary giants talking about it. And I stumbled upon this one thing that James A. Michener wrote, also another, I'm pretty sure another American who liked to talk about the Spanish and bullfighting. And he had something fascinating to say about bullfights. Now, first off, I cannot roll my R, so I am going to get some of this wrong. I'm going to try and read what he says. Let me make one thing clear. Most corridas are a disappointment. Of 100 corridas taken at random, at least 80 will be bores. 10 will be reasonably good, 5 will be unquestionably good, 4 will be worth remembering, and 1 might be superb. Therefore, the mathematical chances of simply buying a ticket on impulse and seeing a good fight are at least 4-1 against. Why is that interesting? I think it's interesting because that's around about the same numbers, the same proportions, the same experience I have looking at other people's states of the collection video. 4 out of 5 of them, I just pass over. I glance through. You can see where it's going pretty early. There's not a lot of drama in it. There's not a lot of excitement. You click through, see if there's anything interesting, and then quickly move on. It's about 1 in 5, 1 in 4 where I'll slow down, watch more carefully, and really listen because there's something more going on inside that collection. As is always the case, when you do these sorts of, well, certainly for me, when I do these sorts of videos, have these sorts of thoughts, I immediately turn it back in on myself and say, Pete, is this one of the reasons why you haven't done a state of the collection video? Because you worry that your collection, your collecting, would be one of those boring collections. And you know what? There's an element of truth to that. It's an interesting question about, it's one thing to then sort of think that's how I would rate a state of the collection video I was watching. It's another thing altogether to say, would that, should that, might that influence how I collect myself? Would I look down at my own watches and say, you know what, there's a distinct lack of daring there? Would I look at my own watches and say, they're all a bit obvious, Pete. I'm not seeing a lot of skill, grace, elegance coming through in what you're doing here. I don't know. That's probably the next stage for me, which is to say, thinking of my own collecting and my own collecting, do I even want to think of it that way? And if I do, what would it be? I don't know. As I said, that's probably the next stage of this thought process. So anyway, in answering the question, are there bad collections? I and all of you seem to decide, no, there's not. Are there good collections and other collections? Yes, most of us seem to think that that's the case. And once you get past there, there's a whole world opens up of how do you assess whether something's good or not. Anyway, I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches. I would love to have your thoughts on this. I'll see you later. Bye.